Okay, here we go. Okay, so today's Daf Bez Hashem is Masechta Zevachim Daf Mem Hey, and we're going to start from Mem Dalet Amud Beis. You can see it on the screen, right, Tanya? Reb Lezer Oimer. It's about like 20 lines from the bottom. My point is not on, but it's at the end of the line. Tanya, we're going to put it to the top of the screen. Okay. So, hi, Lewis. We just began. Mem Dalet Amud Beis. Tanya, we learned in a brisa. This is we're going back to the stuff of pigel, and the Gemara is discussing over here a very basic halacha, which we know that pigel could apply even by a carbon that was brought on the inside, by the base of Mikdash, inside the heichal. It's called a chatas panimi, a seir panimi, where you sprinkle the blood on the paraiches, on the mizbeach panimi. So we learned that there's pigel applies to that kind of a carbon too. Those carbonas are par helam davar shatziba, the par kohen gadol, the seir kohen gadol, the seir that was born in Yom Kippur. So Tanya, we learned to the brisa. Reb Loza oimer mishum Reb Yossi Galili. Reb Loza says in the name of Reb Yossi Galili, pigel bedavar hanase bachutz. Pigel, pigel. If you mifagel with something with an avoida that was done on the outside of the sanctuary, not inside the heichal, then it becomes pigel. Bedava hanaase befnim loy pigel. If you mifagel the carbon with an avoida that's done only inside the sanctuary, loy pigel. This carbon will not become pigel. Ketzad. So says the Gemara. How's that? What's the cases? A guy is standing in the Azara. Okay, he's standing in the Azara. And he says, top of the line, Hareini shoichet lahazes midama lamachay. I'm going to shech this animal to sprinkle the blood tomorrow. So he's with it. Where do you sprinkle a par hanasa befnim, a par helam davar shetzibar? You sprinkle the blood, is it inside the heichal? Loy pigel. You didn't make the carbon pigel. Why? This is you're having the bad thought when you're shechting in the azara, but it's about something that you're going to do inside the sanctuary. So loy pigel. That does not make it pigel. If you're standing inside the sanctuary, the big building, and you said, Hareini maza almanas lahakter eimarim v'lishpach shiraim lamachar. He says, I'm going to be makter the eimarim, the fats, which belong on the outside mizbeach, or spill the rest of the extra blood on the side of the mizbeach. I'm going to do it lamachar, tomorrow. So, loy pigel, you didn't make this carbon pigel. And that's very, very interesting. It's a avoida that's nasa b'chutz, but when did you say this? When did you say this bad thought? While you were in the sanctuary. This is a thought on the inside on something that you're going to that's something that's supposed to be done on the outside. But if you're standing in the Azara, regular place where they shecht, and he says, I'm going to shech this cow to spill the extra blood tomorrow, or to be makter the emerim tomorrow. Pigel, you made it pigel. Why? Because there you got it correctly. It's a machshava that happened outside the sanctuary in an avoida that's supposed to be done outside the sanctuary, on the outside mizbeach. So that's why, that's the only way you could be mefagel, make pigel, a carbon that's supposed to be sprinkled inside the sanctuary, inside the heichal. Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Rabbi Shua ben Levi says, Ma'ikra. What is the pasuk? What's the source of that? So Kasha, the Gemara answers, Kasha Yura Mishar Zevach Hashlabim. The Torah tells you by a par Helam Davar Shotzibar that you should know you should do the Amirim like you do by a Shlomim. Put it on the outside Mizbeach. So the Gemara says that's an extra pasuk. What do I learn from a Shar Zevach Hashlamim with this pasuk? That you do Amirim and you take the Amirim of the Par Kohen Mashiach and you put it on the outside Mizbeach, I know that from the regular pasuk. There's a clear pasuk by the Par Kohen Mashiach is that's what you're supposed to do. Elamakish, there's a juxtaposition. Par Kohen Mashiach l'shar zevach hashlamim. You juxtapose the Par Kohen Mashiach to the cow of the zevach hashlamim. Ma shar zevach hashlamim, just like a regular shlamim. Ad sheyu masav v'machshavosav al mizbeach hakitzim. Supposed to reverse that. The actual thought and the actual thought about the action all happen on the outside mizbeach. Av kohen par Mashiach, in order to make a par kohen Mashiach pigel, until the machshava and the maisa, that means the bad thought and what you're thinking about to do should be regarding the mizbeach hachitzim, what you do on the outside mizbeach. So there's what the Gemara just got through saying is that there are big limitations on how to make a carbon hanasa b'fnim. Those cows that you're supposed to bring inside the sanctuary, there's limitations on how to make them pigel. So now the Gemara says, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba Baravu, Amar Rav, Halacha Rabbi Loza, Mishama Mishim Rabbi Yossi. This is an interesting thing. We paskin like Rabbi Loza, who said in the name of Rabbi Yossi, that's to make a carbon pigel on the that's supposed to be a chata shenasa b'fnim, you need to be both. The machshava and the maisa have to be something that's done outside the sanctuary. Now the Gemara is just troubled by this is the first time in Masechtas Zevachim where we discuss halacha is like who? Who cares? We don't have a Beis Hamikdash. Amar Rava, so Rava said, and we go to the top of Memhei of Aleph. This is a beautiful question. Hilchas Mashiach why do I need to know the halachas when Mashiach comes? When Mashiach comes, that's when we'll ask the rabbis then at that time what to do. Why does the Gemara have to discuss that? Amalei Abayas, or Abayas says, what kind of question is that? He said to Rabbah, Elamiata, then we shouldn't even learn Masechtas Zevachim. Kol Shchitas Kachim Loi Lisni. We shouldn't learn the whole Masechtas Zevachim because it's not relevant now. Hilchas Mashiachu. That's the halacha for Mashiach. Eladroish, you learn the Kabba Sachar and you'll get reward eventually. You learn Masechtas Zevachim, you get reward. Achinami, so just learn who the halacha is. Droish the Kabba Sachar. Learn it and you'll get reward. So that's the answer. So the Gemara says, Rabbah said, Hachi Kaminalach. My question was to you, I know it's a nice thing to learn Masechtas Zevachim. You learn Masechtas Zevachim even though it's not relevant, but you get schar for learning it, right? We get a lot of schar for learning Masechtas Zevachim. But Hilkasa Lamali, why do you have to tell me who the halacha is like? Lishnachrina Amalei Halacha Kamina. I was worried about, I'm concerned about why you're telling me who we paskin. It's the same thing. In other words, don't tell me who you paskin like because that's not relevant. Because that you have to wait till Mashiach comes and then you ask the rabbis then. So therefore, that was my troubling. New Mishnah. Kache, the Mishnah says like this: Memhei Amar Aleph. Kache goyim ein chayavim aleim mishum pigel. One of the things we know that a goy can make a neder and a dava, make a donation to the Beis Hamikdash with a carbon, just like any yid. But there's a difference. Ein chayavim aleim mishum pigel noiser v'tameh. You can't make a goy's carbon pigel, and it can't become which pigel again. If you eat pigel from a Jewish carbon, you get kares. So that it can't be noiser. It can't be noiser. You can't have noiser from a goyish carbon, which means if the guy leaves it over, doesn't eat it up on time, it doesn't become noiser. The tameh, and we know a person who's tameh is not allowed to eat kachim, and if he does, what do you get? Kares. But if you eat a goyish carbon, a tameh that eats of the meat from a goyish carbon, he doesn't get kares. And because the goyish carbon is different than a Jewish carbon. If a guy takes a goyish carbon and shechts it outside the Beis Hamikdash, potter, you don't get kares. Rab Shimon, this is the words of Rab Shimon. Rabbi Yossi Mechayev. Rabbi Yossi says a goyish carbon is the same as a Yiddish carbon, and therefore it has the same halachas. Tana Rabbanim. We start the Gemara. Kachi goyim the kachim belonging to goyim, loy nehenem v'loy ma'alim. You cannot have a joy. If it's, let's say, a guy is donating an ox for a carbon, a shar, so then you cannot use it to plow your field. V'loy ma'alim. But if you did use it, you don't get the avera of me'ila. Like you saw in our Mishnah, one is not chayev on a goyish carbon pigel noiser and tamei. Ve'ein oisim tamura, and it cannot effectuate a tamura. Whereas a Jewish guy who has a carbon, if he says this should be like this, he has two animals. One is the carbon. He says this animal should be like my carbon animal. So then they're both holy. But with tamura, it means like an exchange. And they're both holy, the Torah tells you. But whereas a goyish carbon, tamura doesn't apply. You can't say, if you say to the goyish carbon that this animal should be like the goyish carbon, it doesn't mean anything. The goy cannot donate flour and wine to the mizbeach. Their carbon needs nesachim. In other words, every carbon requires flour and wine on the mizbeach. They can't donate it as an independent entity, but if they're donating a carbon animal, then they bring along flour and wine. Divrei Rabbi Shimon. These are the words of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yossi says, I would say you go strict on a goyish carbon. Shenema behen lashem. The Torah tells you lashem. Their carbon is like to God, and it has the same characteristics as a Yiddish carbon. And the kachem is back. Says Rabbi Yossi, I don't say Yechayev Mi'ila if it was Kachem Mizbeach, if it was a carbon. There, Rabbi Yossi draws the line. He says, you're not going to Yechayev Mi'ila. But if they make a donation to the Beis Hamikdash proper, let's say they donate a bench to the Beis Hamikdash, so then that has a din of Mi'ila. That's where Rabbi Yossi is Machmir. So, Loy Nehenem v'loy Me'alim. A goyish carbon, you can't benefit, and you don't have Mi'ila. Loy Nehenem midrabanan. You're not supposed to benefit from a goyish carbon. Again, if a guy donates an ox, he wants to bring an ox for a carbon, you cannot plow a field with that ox. That's a din dirabanan. But if you did do it, you don't chayav the carbon mi'ila. The Gamar, how do you know mi'ila does not apply by a goy? The Gamar mi'ila, the Gamar mi'ila chet mitruma. You have a gzera shava chet from truma. The truma ksib b'nei Yisrael v'legoyim. By truma it says truma can only be given by a Jew, so therefore not by a goy. And now we have a gzera shava because it says the word chet by truma, and it says the word chet by Me'ila. The Torah says, as you see Rashi, ksiv b'me'ila v'chota b'shkaga, and it says by truma v'lisa all of chet, and then the Torah says by truma it doesn't apply only by a yid, not by a guy. So we're going to say the same thing. We're going to say the same thing that this only applies by me'ila, only applies by a yid and not a guy. My tama. Why doesn't it apply? The also pigel my tama. The also pigel oven menoiser. Also noiser chilul metuma. Over tima ksiv b'nei Yisrael v'loy. You see, by tuma, eating a carbon when you're tame, the Torah says only. It says the word b'nei Yisrael only by a Jewish carbon, not a goyish carbon. So that tells me that Tumah only applies by a Jewish carbon, not a Goyish carbon. But then we have a Gzeir Shava, Chilel from Tumah, which tells you that Noiser, it says the word Chilel, and it says the word Chilel by Tumah. So we have a Gzeir Shava that Noiser is like Tumah, which does not apply by a Goyish carbon. And now Pigel has a Gzeir Shava, oven from Noiser. And just like now we know that Noiser doesn't apply by a Goyish carbon, Pigel will also not apply by a goyish carbon. So that's a double gzeira shava. The ain oisin tamura. We know it cannot make tamura. Why can't the goyish carbon make tamura? My tama. Why can't it make tamura? The iskesh tamura l'maasa behema, because there's a hekesh between tamura and maasa behema. Right? A maasa behema is like, as you know, every 10th you take all the animals that were born this year and you run them through a gate, and that each 10th one has to be brought as a carbon. And that was, you gave 10% of all the animals that were born this year as a carbon. So this din of Maisa Behema is compared to Maisa Shady. Well, Maisa Behema iskish the Maisa Dagam. Maisa Behema is compared to Maisa Dagam. So now let's settle, let's square everything off. Uva Maisa Dagam. Maisa Shady, it says Ksiv B'nai Yisrael. Maisa Sheni, it says applies only by Bnei Yisrael. The loy goyim doesn't apply by goyim. So now Maisa Sheni doesn't apply by goyim. So you'll say the same thing. Maisa Behema also does not apply by goyim. And Tamura, which is compared to Maisa Behema in one pasuk, will also not apply by goyim. So the answer is that Maisa Behema was taught that Maisa Behema does not apply by Goyim, and the teacher was Maisa Sheni. Now Maisa Behema can now teach Tamura that it will also not apply by Goyim, by a Goyish carbon. So the Gemara asks a question: Can Maisa Behema teach Tamura that it does not apply by Goyim? Maisa Behema itself was taught via a hekesh that it doesn't apply by goyim. And we have a rule in Kachim that if you are a kodesh, if you're in Kachim and you learned something from a hekesh, you can't teach it to another din in the Torah. And that's a rule in Kachim. So that's the Gemara's question. Something that it itself, like Maisa Behema, only learned that it doesn't apply by Goyish Behema, was taught in a Hegesh. Can it teach Tamura that it also does not apply by a Goyish carbon? And says the Gemara, Masa Dagan Chulanhu. Maisa Behema learned its teaching from Maisa Sheni. And Maisa Sheni is not Kachim, it's not Karbonos. So it's not totally something that was learned by a Hekesh to Kachim. Says the Gemara, if it's true what you're saying, that we always look at the teacher. If the teacher is Kachim, then you can't teach it to somewhere else. But according to the opinion, it says that you look at the student. Here the student is, Maisa Sheni is teaching Maisa Behema something. And Maisa Behema is going to go teach it to Maisa Tamura. That cannot be. Because since Maisa Behema only learned its teaching via a Hekesh, and Maisa Behema is Kachim, it cannot reteach that idea to something else via a Hekesh. So what are you going to say? Says the Gemara, Maisa Behema choyvesh ein kavua lazman. Answer is really, Maisa Behema, I'll know that it does not apply by a goy. Because Maisa Behema is a type of obligation. There's no set time when you have to give Maisa Behema. It's when you're counting your animals, that's when you set aside Maisa Behema. Any type of choiva, Yisrael Maisi, goyim like Maisi. A Jew brings and a goy doesn't bring. In other words, there's no such a thing of an obligation, a choiva, for a goy to do. A guy doesn't bring chatas, osham, shalmei chegiga, oilas re'iyah. It doesn't bring these type of karbanos. Only if it makes a voluntary donation. So therefore, Maisa Behema by itself, we can figure out it doesn't apply by goyim. So now that I know Maisa Behema doesn't apply by goyim from its own, then it could teach by Tamura that it doesn't apply by a goy. Tana Rabban, the aim of the Inasachim. And Maisa says, the pasuk says that a goy cannot donate independently flour and wine on the mizbeach. Tana Rabbanim, Ezrach. The pasuk says Ezrach maybe nesachim. A Jew from birth brings nesachim. Then goy maybe nesachim, but a goy does not bring nesachim. Yacha loitehei oilasem nesachim. And maybe I would think that if he brings a carbon oila, an animal, so then you don't bring the flour and wine along with it. Talmud loime kocha. The pasuk says kocha yaseh, which means that this is to be done because you're bringing an animal. The animal requires you to bring the wine and flour on the mizbeach, so it has really nothing to do with the goy, and therefore, if the goy donates an animal, he brings nesachim as well. Homer of Yosi, My timer. What is the reason why Rabbi Yossi holds kotshe bedek habayis there is meila and not by kotshe mizbeach? My tama kisava ki gomer meila chet mitruma dumi de truma the kedusha zagov. Meila will not apply to a korban, an animal which has a kedusha zagov. So meila doesn't apply if it's a goyish korban. Ava kedushas bedek habayis, when a guy donates something to the Beis Hamikdash, he's not donating, the item itself has no kedusha per se, it's the value of the item that has kedusha. So then the kedusha's damin, that is a value situation. Then you won't say this idea. You will say that there is meila. So if a guy donates a bench to the Beis Hamikdash, you could you chayiv meila if you violate it, if you use it for personal purposes. However, if he's donating a korban and use the animal for personal purposes, there is no meila. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Dam sheniz titma uzraka b'shoige kurza. Dam that became tame. Let's say a guy's bringing an oila, and right before he's sprinkling it on the mizbeach, the blood became tame, and you sprinkled it anyway, b'shoige kurza. If you did it by mistake, kurza, then Hashem accepts your korban. We go to Memheyam Beis, because the mezid loy hurtza. If you do it on purpose, loy hurtza, Hashem is not happy with you. The truth is that what brings a kapara for all this is the tzitz, the carbon, the clothing that the kohen wears makes sure that the carbon is accepted. But the Chachamim said that if you knew for sure that this blood is tamei and you sprinkled it onto the mizbeach, you're not allowed to eat from that carbon. You don't have to bring a new one, but you're not allowed to eat from that carbon. So by an individual, alva betzivar, whether it's accident or on purpose, if you throw it on the mizbeach when it's tamei, hurtza, you got the kapara. Uva goyim, a goyish carbon, and the blood became tamei, bein shoigig, bein mezid, loy hurtza, then it's not a good carbon. In other words, you're not allowed to eat from that carbon, whether you threw the blood by mistake or on purpose on the mizbeach, loy hurtza. Amrua, Rabbanan kamed rapapa, Rabbanan repeated this brisa to rapapa, and they asked him a question. Come on, who's the author of this brisa? The loik Rabbi Yossi. The Rabbi Yossi, ha'ama kulani roi lahachmeh. This brisa cannot be like Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi always says that a goy is mamish like a yid. So a goyish carbon should b'shoigik hurtza b'mezid loy hurtza. And this brisa says on the second line, the goyim bein b'shoigik bein b'mezid loy hurtza. It doesn't work. Papa says, Rabbi Yossi. Say that this brisa goes according to Rabbi Yossi. Shana Hasam, by over there, to Amakra Lahem v'loy legoyim. That means that the tzitz that Hakadosh Baruch that the Kohen Gadol wears, which brings about a kapara for anybody who sprinkles tamei blood on the mizbeach, that only applies gives kapara lehem to the Jewish people. V'loy legoyim, not to goyim. Amalei Rav Huna b'rei Rav Ratzon l'Rapapa el miata shehei magdishem hakanami v'loy goyim. Are you going to say that ashehei magdishem, that a goy cannot give? The pasuk says, are you going to say koche goyim are not? It's hey magdishem. The Torah tells us that a person shouldn't eat from a carbon that a Jew is makdish. So darshan the same thing. Hey magdishem v'loy goyim. That only if it's a Jewish carbon, tumah doesn't apply. Tumah applies, but not by a goyish carbon. And Rabbi Yossi himself said that by a goyish carbon, even tumah applies. Ela amarav ashi amakra l'rotzein lehem v'goyim la b'nei haratzaninu. This is another pasuk by the tzitz that says that it only brings kapara for Jews and not for goyim. Therefore, there's no way that a goy who brings the blood on the mizbeach and it's tamei, it's a successful carbon. It's not accepted. Now we're going to go to start the Mishnah, and we'll stop in 2 minutes. Dvarim she'ein chayavim aleim pigel. Let's say you have an item that doesn't have pigel applied to it. For example, like we saw in the Mishnah before, a ketores. Let's say ketores that you bring on the inside mizbeach, pigel doesn't apply. But chayavim aleim mishum noiser mishum tamei. It's possible it could be noiser or tamei. A koimitz could be noiser. And tamei, a tamei person, if he eats the ketores, If he eats the ketairis, according to the Tanakama, he gets kares. Chutz min adam, except blood. The blood that's on the mizbeach, let's say, and let's say you ate the blood of a carbon, and you're tameh, you don't get, there's no noiser, and there's no such a thing of eating it betuma. Reb Shimon mechayev. Reb Shimon says, yechayev bedavar shadar kelechel. It has to be something that a normal person would eat, like the koimitz and the levina, the flour that's supposed to be brought in the mizbeach, the scoop of flour, and the frankincense. That's edible. Ketairis is not edible. So the Rav Shimon is going to hold ketairis. You're not chayev of noiser and tomei, and noiser for sure not. But tomei, it doesn't apply. Abel, eitzim, balavoina, bakataris, ein chayam lemishum tuma. That's what Rav Shimon says. Wood, lavoina, which is not edible, ketairis is not edible. Ein chayam lemishum tuma. There's no problem if you eat it betuma. Says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanim. The rabbis taught, Yochal, I would think, lo yechayv mishum tuma el adova sheyesh le matirim. Bein la'odem bein l'zbeach. I would think that you shouldn't be chayev betuma, only something that is like, say, that has like the meat of a carbon, but not the meat of the carbon, or the shiyare menachos should be chayev of tuma, but not the koimitz itself. The dinu pigel, ma pigel should be kviya b'diachas liyut meklole ein chayavim el dav shesh lemitim bein l'odem bein l'mizbeach. Tuma shiba oil of yarder shtei yadir so hutra meklala ein yadin she ein chayev el dav shesh lemitim bein l'odem bein l'mizbeach. Pigel, which is a much harder avera, only applies by the leftover of the menachos, not the koimitz and the levina, and the dam and everything else. These things don't apply. So we're going to say tuma doesn't apply for koimitz and levina either. That no matter what, it always applies. Tuma always applies, even on the parts that pigel doesn't apply. Says the Gemara, last question. Yochal miyad. Maybe I would think that as soon as you makriv a carbon, before you do anything, if a tamei person eats it, he's chayiv misa. Talmud loyme yikrav. It says, the Torah says yikrav. You have to bring it on them as touch it. Amar Rabbi Loza v'chiyesh negeish chayiv. Alamal Talmud lo yikrav. V'chuchsha basa likarev akasam medaber. So the Torah is telling you, when is a tamei chayiv when he eats these things? Hakeitzad yesh lo matirim mishikiriv matirim. If it's a meat or the flour of a mincha, you have to be makriv the koimitz first. Then a tamei is not allowed to eat the rest of the mincha. Or you first put blood on the mizbeach. Then a tamei has the issakaris if he eats the meat. Ein lo matirim. But if it's something that doesn't have a matir, mishikrivu. You put it into a keli. As soon as you put it into a keli, as soon as you put that koimitz and levina into a keli, that's when the tamei is not allowed to eat it. Okay, we'll stop right over here. Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Good night.